Hi, I am Teresa Giles. I'm here today to disclose a story, the beacon of hope. This story is a story that America knows about, most people in America. It was in 1989 that the Central Park Five was arrested, falsely accused of a rape that took place in Central Park. But on the eve of July of 2001, a beacon of hope appeared in Auburn prison. And this gentleman was used as the catalyst to exonerate the Central Park Five, and their sentence was vacated. This beacon of hope gave advice to the one Matias Reyes to write the confession letter that exonerated the Central Park Five. And tonight I'm going to interview the gentleman that is responsible. This is the Untold story. But this story is so familiar to most of us in America because this story is a mirror to what happened to Emmett Till back in 1955. He too was 14 years old when a surge of whites falsely accused him. What happened to Emmett Till was generations before, and that same spirit has hoovered in people and caused them to continuously do this vicious attack against young black boys. I believe some of them may have the spirit of their grandfather, great-grandfather, great-great, and you can take it all the way back to slavery, where you think that you have authority over someone and you're used like a grand wizard to kill, steal, and destroy their lives. But because of this transformation, and he came to someone else who had a heart, a lie was overturned on behalf of the Central Park Five. And we're going to dissect this story today. Anthony Grainger, who was the catalyst used to exonerate the Central Park Five. We're here where it took place in Auburn, New York, 6 miles away from Harriet Tubman's estate, where her body was laid to rest here in Auburn, New York. That spirit of freedom still reigns. And it is here in Auburn, New York, where the confession was made so that the Central Park Five would be exonerated. Born Anthony Smith Grainger on January 7th, 1966. Anthony was born in Syracuse, New York, where he grew up during his formative years in what is known as Brick City. It was during those formative years that Anthony's mother took him to church every Sunday, where she comes from a lineage of pastors and preachers and deacons in her family. But when Anthony became a teenager, his mother moved from the bricks. And then Anthony started boxing for the Syracuse Friends Amateur Boxing League. During his teenage years, that's what he did. And he almost went pro, according to Anthony, until an incident happened with his eyes. After that, Anthony, like many of us, I too included, experienced what many people experience in our United States communities. Cocaine dropped in our communities, and we became victims of it. Playing with it like it's a toy, not understanding what the results would be. Some ended up addicted. Some lost their jobs. Some ended up dead. Some ended up in prison. Many lost their children. The wide range of repercussions touched almost every community in America. Well, Anthony Smith Grainger ended up receiving a sentence of 22 years to life in 1992 and ended up in Auburn Correctional Facility. It was in Auburn Correctional Facility that things began to change and turn for his good. He became highly recognized by high-ranking professionals, and Anthony received commendable behavior reports. Anthony received one from such named Craig Gummerson, who had been employed for 32 years at Auburn Correctional Facility. He received another from a Lynn Anderson, who was a counselor at Auburn Correctional Facility. And then Anthony received one of the highest honors from Captain John Rourke, naming Anthony as one of the most trustworthy, reliable, responsible individual with character during his 32 years at Auburn Correctional Facility. Mr. Rourke said he had made it a policy never to give a recommendation for early release for inmates. But in the case of Anthony Smith Grainger, he had to make the exception to the rule. I also read a report with 139 signatures from officers recommending the early release of Anthony Smith Grainger. But going back to John, Captain John, he said that he began to trust Anthony with sensitive materials, going around sensitive material and going into sensitive areas because of his character. And he recommended him, again I said, for early release. So not only did his reputation flow through the jail as he was on A block, but inmates began to look up to him too and rely on him and trust him as they saw that type of character flowing from officers to other inmates. And on the eve of July of 2001, something happened that changed the trajectory for the Central Park Five. And I'd like Mr. Anthony to tell the world what happened. Hello?
Hello there.
And your name, sir?
My name is Anthony Smith Grainger.
Okay. And today I would like to discuss with you your story. You've disclosed it to me, and now we're going to disclose it to the world. Before I go into the story, most people come up with all kinds of connections to other people's stories in life. Some of them are fraudulent, some of them are true. But just to validate this gentleman's story, I have read through countless pages of validation, behavioral reports of high-ranking officials at Auburn Correctional Facility on behalf of this gentleman's trustworthiness, on behalf of his character, validating the type of gentleman he is, validating the genuinity and the authenticity of who he is, which gives a strong belief that everything that he's saying is true. The Bible has a scripture that says, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." And that's what gravitated him to the position that he was in when he gave the recommendation. So I just aforementioned the three high-ranking officials' recommendation based on the credibility and the trustworthiness of Mr. Anthony Smith Grainger. But equally so, inmates felt the same way about his character, about his trustworthiness. Matias Reyes asked Mr. Anthony Smith Grainger for his advice on a matter. And I'd like Mr. Anthony Smith Grainger to tell the world what took place on the eve of July 2001. How you doing, Mr. Grainger?
I'm doing fine there, Miss Giles.
Okay, Mr. Grainger, can you tell the world what took place in Auburn Prison on A block where you were stationed, and so was Matias Reyes, on the eve of July 2001? one.
Yes, it came about the time when I was locking an A Block 5 Company 20 cell, and Matias Reyes was locking an A Block 5 Company 35 cell. And I happened to be coming to do my duties, giving out water and cleaning up the company after the 5 o'clock count. And when I stopped in front of Matias Reyes' cell, he said, "Top Dog," which that was the nickname that they used for me. He said, "I need to talk to you about something." He said, "I got something real heavy on my mind." I said, "So let me get finished taking care of the company, and I'm gonna pull back up on you." I said, so after I got finished doing my duties, I went back to his cell and I said, "What's good, bro?" I said, "Spit it out, don't choke on me." And so he was like, "Listen, man, I'm doing 33 to life. You know, I'm not never going home." He said, "You know, I found God and I want to do what's right." You know, I said, "What are you talking about?" He said, "Yo, I seen one of them out in the yard today and I was going to tell him, but I wanted to wait to come in and talk to you because I see how all the officers and the inmates look up to you." So I said, "Yeah." I said, "What you talking about?" He said, "You know the Central Park 5? I said, "Yeah." He said, "They didn't do that. I did that." And I was like, wilted. I was like, "Get that body." I said, "You the one did that?" And he was like, "Yes." And I said, "Listen, man, they beat them kids into a confession." You know, I said, "They suffering." He said, "I know, I feel bad about this, you know." He said, "You know, I got God in my life now and I want to do what's right, you know." I said, "Well, if you can do it," I said, "What you can do is this." I said, "Listen, before I leave your cell, you're gonna pull your locker over to your bed and you're gonna write that confession out." I said, "And when I come out in the morning, I want to see that letter ready to go." You know, and he was like, "Yeah, I appreciate this. You know, I knew that, you know, you would give me the proper advice." He said, "Here, I want you to have something." And I said, "What is that?" He said, "Here, I want you to take this watch. This is the exact same watch that Matias Reyes gave me, was 25 years ago." And I kept it. And when I came out in the morning, Matias was standing there with his light on, with the letter written in his hand, ready to go. And I said, "My man," I said, "I'm proud of you." You know, he said, "Yeah, I just want to do the right thing. I've been up all night." So 45 minutes later, after they started running the child bill for the mess hall, me and Matias Reyes, we walked down to the mess hall together.
Can I stop you for 1 second?
Yes, ma'am.
Because I've heard your story. I've even taken the notes on the story. Let's go back to you telling him to pull his locker over to his bed. What was the purpose of you telling him to pull his locker? Because the locker was used for what?
Well, our lockers, we would use them to write on.
Oh, like a desk?
Yes, like a desk, yes.
Oh, okay.
And I told him, I said, within a week, somebody's going to be up here to see you. And after he mailed the letter, I witnessed him mail the letter.
No, okay, so let's get to that. You said that you, let's go back to where you left out that morning. Because I want them to know all the details and the facts of what happened. Let's go back just a little bit more because I've talked to you and I have the notes on it. When he said, "I found God and I feel bad," right? Is that what you say he said?
Yes.
And so what was your response to him? Something that just tickled me pink.
When I told him, I said, "You know what?" I said, "God forgives 700 times 70.
Which is something. He says 700 times 70. The disciples asked Jesus, "How many times shall we forgive a man? 7 times?" And Jesus' response was no, 70 times 7, which is 449, 490 times. And so when this gentleman told me that he thought he was quoting the Bible, but though he was not quoting the Bible, he was quoting some facts about really how much God forgives us.
Absolutely.
So he said 700 times 70. So that's the little joke that we have between ourselves. And I said, well, he might have forgave me 7 million times 7, you know. And so, and so I just wanted to disclose that because that's our personal joke, the 700 times 70.
Yes.
Because most of us know we've done more than 490 things wrong in life. So you could put your own math together. He said 700 times 70. I said 7 million. But okay, that's just a side note. Moving forward, now let's go back to that morning when you came down by his cell. What was you doing? You were passing out water that morning, you said, right?
Yes.
Okay, so because you was the water guy for the unit that you all lived in, correct?
Correct.
And so when you came, tell the audience what Matias was doing as you began to approach his cell. You told me, and I want you to be specific to the audience. He was standing there.
He was standing right there at the front gate of his cell with the envelope sealed up, holding it in his hand, saying, "Here it is." And I said, "My man," you know, just like that.
Okay. So he took your advice. He wrote the confession letter that night. And when you got ready to pass water that morning and approach his cell, he had that sealed confession.
He was up bright and early with his light on, told me I've been up all night writing this.
Okay. And what was his behavior like when you, because you told me what it was.
He was very joyous.
Mm-hmm.
He felt relieved that he finally got a chance to speak with someone who could give him proper advice.
Okay.
And he said that he wrote this letter with the intent to really get these guys free based on me giving him advice.
So again, I say, according to the word of God, you let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. So based on the testimonies of the 3 high-ranking officials, there were some things you did that your light was shining all through the prison. So you were out that night when everybody else was locked in. Was that your norm because of the duties that you had at the prison?
That is my norm by orders of the superintendent, which was John W. Burge at the time, Captain John Rourke, Captain Craig Gummerson. By orders of these high-ranking officials, as they say, top dog locks down when the jail locks down. All the other watermen are in by 8:30.
And the reason that happened because of the security, as I read in the story, there was something that took place. I read it. People probably don't know what all that meant. And so briefly, so I could go back to when you all was called to go to breakfast, which in jail they refer to as the mess hall. So prior to that, what took place to give you this honorable recognition? Break it down for them. This honorable recognition, this behavior report that spread throughout the prison to give you special privileges, because that's what you had, right?
Yes.
Because your light was so shining. But what was that light that first flickered on when it came to the security breach? Briefly tell us that so we can move on.
Well, I happened to be coming off the visit one day, and there was a guy by the name of Officer O'Grady. Mm-hmm. He had the lockbox wide open with the keys hanging in there, and he was way down the company because they had just ran 3:30 to 5 rec. We had early rec that day. So when I came up, I was waiting for him to come down to the company, and I said there was a couple other guys over from 6 Company that was standing there, and they came over and they started saying, things that wasn't appropriate, calling the guy different names, saying he's, so he looked at him, he left the keys in the lockbox, and he was like, you should get him and throw him out, throw him away. So me, with split-second judgment, knowing that if these keys get lost or damaged or anything, this jail is gonna be locked down for at least 30 days. And with that industry that they have over there, that industry makes over $10 million a month. So there's no reason that they're gonna wanna be locked down that long, because, they got the cab shop, the wood shop, and the plate shop, and it's business for New York State. But I prevented these guys from getting the keys, and I closed the lockbox and went down the company, and he met me. By the time I got the 20 cell, the officer's coming down. I said, here, I said, take these keys, man. I said, you left the keys in the lockbox. I said, you almost lost them. He said, did you lock the lockbox? I said, no, I closed it, but you better go down there and lock it,
Oh, okay.
And that's how that situation happened.
And so I'm just going to say this, and we're going to go on to the gym when you all was headed out to breakfast. It reminds me of Mordecai in the book of Esther. And so I think it is a time now where his story reminds me of Mordecai, who prevented these people from killing the king. And then one night when the king couldn't sleep and he was going through the Chronicles, he said, have anything ever been done for the man that saved the king's life? And so it had not been done, though this had happened some time previous to the night that he was reading the Chronicles. And so then the king did the honorable thing for Mordecai, who some time prior, I don't know if it's years, the Bible doesn't say it, but that he was rewarded for this. And I pray in this situation, because people have an opportunity, especially the Central Park 5, have an opportunity to find out, was this the gentleman that talked to Matias to suggest, to recommend, and to get right on it that very next morning to make sure that the confession was made and mailed off to the DA, because that gentleman, Matias Reyes, was depending on the advice of this credible gentleman, as he said, that he noticed that the officers and other inmates had much respect for Anthony Smith Grainger, and so he came to him for advice. And based on the advice that Anthony Smith Grainger gave Matias Reyes, Matias followed up on that advice, wrote that confession letter, and then had it ready, feeling free, because God had already began a work in his life. And I pray that this message get to those gentlemen, and they can somehow tell this man thank you, because it was based on the advice of Anthony Smith Grainger at Auburn Correctional Facility that he gave that advice to Matias Reyes to write the confession, and he did, and they followed through. Okay, so Anthony Grainger, I want to know what happened that morning. You said he was jubilant in his cell, waving the sealed letter of confession, and what took place after that?
Well, I said,
as we're coming to the end of this story, what took place
after he showed me that he had the letter completed and ready to go? I finished taking care of the company, and 45 minutes later or so, we walked to the mess hall. I said, when we were side by side,
okay,
and he stopped down in front of the mailbox when we got on the first floor, and he deposited the letter in the mailbox, and we proceeded to the mess hall. And I had told him, I said, within a week, somebody's gonna respond to you because you confessing the truth. And as days went by, me and him would be talking to each other. I'd go in front of his cell and talk. And, he'd make me a bowl of food. I'd make him a bowl of food. He was really, really enthused about it. He was really waiting to get an answer. And as I told him, within a week, it was exactly 5 days that they came up in the facility to see him. Because I was standing in front of his cell talking to him when Officer Chris Badillak, when he popped the cell and told him to visit. And Matias, at that time, Matias came right out of his cell. He looked at me. He gave me that look. We already knew who it was because he wasn't really getting no visits.
Oh, okay.
So when he came out, I gave him a hug and I patted him on his back, shook his hand. I said, "Go get him, man." And I watched him from the top tier of 5 company where we locked on.
Uh-huh.
I watched him walk to the visit on his own.
Uh-huh.
And it was about an hour and a half later, I seen Officer Spafford escorting Matias Reyes to the other side of the jail C and D quarters. He was now being placed in protective custody.
Okay.
And after that, Officer Chris Badillak came upstairs and he said, "Hey, top dog, chain his cell up. He not coming back." I said, "Already know." I said, "I just seen Officer Spafford escorting him over to PC."
Uh-huh.
So he says, "What's that about?"
Okay.
I said, "Listen." I said, "You know the Central Park 5? He said, "Yeah." I said, "He the one did that."
Uh-huh.
And Officer Chris Badillak was like, "Get the F out of here." Like I said, he was like, "He been up here all this time on this company and we didn't know it."
Mm-hmm.
I said, "Listen, last week he confessed me. He confessed, and I told him to write the confession out. I told him within a week somebody would be up here to see him. It is exactly 5 days from the time it took the letter to get from Auburn to New York City, 3 days, and then 2 more extra days. They were up here in the facility."
Okay.
And so he said,
Oh, okay.
Officer Chris Badillak said, "Wow," he said, "that's why you the top dog. That's why we love you, and that's why we got you up here."
Oh, glory to Jesus.
And I went, chained the cell, padlock and chained the cell up. And then the next day, Officer Mark Gould came over and he said, "Top dog, help me pack the cell up." We packed Matias Reyes' cell up together. I took his property and put it down on the cart. And Officer Mark Gould took the cart, crossed over the PC to him, took his property to him. Just these officers that I am naming are 3 of the officers' names who are named in 139 signature petition that they put on my behalf on my release.
Okay. All right. So I have another question. Question is, when he came to you after he saw him, after he were being escorted from the visit to go over to protective custody, another unit to live in, once he made the confession, now, why did he tell you to chain up did he bring you a chain and a lock?
Yes, he brought me a padlock and a chain.
Because that's something they entrusted you with?
Yeah, yes, they did.
Oh, wow. Okay. And then, so that shows definitely trustworthy. Who give people chains and locks, and unless it's an officer, right? And then on top of that, when it was time to clean out his cell, because he's been moved to another unit, they came to you to ask to help clean out the cell.
Yes, because 5 Company is my company and I'm in charge of it. Whatever I say goes up there.
Okay. Whatever you say goes. But really what it is your respect. But I understand when you got favor, it goes like that.
Yes.
But it's because of the favor of God that was on your life, even in the prison. It reminds me of Joseph in the Bible, where the Bible said God was with Joseph everywhere he go. He was in the prison, and he became highly respected and favored in the prison. So you've been like a Joseph, you've been like a Mordecai, and now you are all the way over in the New Testament where Jesus says, "Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." And that was a good work. They had already been seeing it in the prison. The officers, I have their statements. I have signatures with these officers' names on it and dates about your credibility, your responsibility, your truthfulness, or your trustworthiness. So as a result of you letting your light so shine before men, we're in the New Testament now, it was prophesied that God would use your life. And from preachers in Syracuse, because we know the previous life that you lived, and that's why you were serving time. But even then, you was doubling back. You'll be in the church, you'll be in the streets. You'll be getting baptized, you'll be in the streets. You'll go to church, you'll be in the streets. You're helping with things in the church, in the community, you'll be in the streets. So, I mean, I know all too well that when there's a call on your life, that you be double back, and the devil don't want to let us go. But there's a day of reckoning when he have to let go. And you're living in that time right now, which is really great. Now, can you share with us one of the, I understand the keys, and you recommended that the officer come and close the lockbox. You stopped the guys from stealing the keys, and that gave you fame throughout the prison. Fame so much so that I remember you mentioning something, a very sensitive area that I don't hardly see people get that type of privilege unless they're an officer. Can you share that with the audience as we get ready to close? And we're just building a platform of his credibility so that even when one day if someone else is interested in talking to him, we're talking about someone that's trustworthy. This is not a scam. This is not a fluke. This is who this gentleman is. There's an area, a very sensitive area they let you go in. Tell the audience about
Well, the sensitive areas that Captain Ward wrote saying that he had me in, for instance, I'll give you a prime example. I was so trustworthy in that jail that I could walk in the room where their firearms is at. And might have an officer tell me, "Top dog, give me that gun belt with the 357." That's how trustworthy I was.
Okay.
They trusted me with their life.
Wow, because for you to pick up a gun belt and hand it, and I know they're not supposed to do that, but they did because they trusted him. And because trust carries a lot of weight. And you demonstrated that where you had officers, superintendents. You have I seen in your records 139 signatures from officers about releasing him because of his personality. And so I just want to thank you for coming on today, sharing with the world, as I think they should know, that you were the untold story, because it did something to us as humans, just to see what those children had went through, to see them be falsely accused and suffer like they did. But God, in his faithfulness, used this gentleman, Anthony Smith Grainger, to advise Matias. After Matias, like he said, I found God and I feel bad. And so having God begin to touch his heart, it was through this gentleman's influence that caused Matias to write that confession and set himself free spiritually, because he didn't want to carry that weight of those 5 gentlemen. And I want to thank you. I like to close out and say, He was like a Mordecai. He was like a Joseph. He was what Jesus said in the Bible, let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven. And in closing, he was who Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And nobody come to the Father but by me. God used this brother as the way that Matias came to him for advice. This brother was used as recommended to Matias to tell the truth so that the Central Park Five can regain their life. The way, the truth, and the life.